room glimmered with opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over a sea of tailored suits and designer dresses. The hum of polite chatter and the clink of champagne glasses filled the space. Tonight wasn't just any gathering, it was Mike's night. His big promotion to vice president at an elite investment firm was being celebrated with all the pomp and grandeur their family could muster. Sarah stood near the back, clutching a glass of sparkling water. She felt the weight of the night pressing down on her. The spotlight wasn't new to Mike. Ever since they were kids, it seemed like the universe conspired to hand him golden opportunities while she was left to carve her own path with dull tools. "You look like you could use something stronger," a voice said. Sarah turned to see her cousin, Karen, offering a sympathetic smile. "I'm fine," Sarah replied, forcing a smile. The truth was she wasn't fine. She'd known this party would sting, but she hadn't expected it to feel like walking barefoot over broken glass. From across the room, her father's booming laugh caught her attention. He was in deep conversation with Mike, their heads tilted toward each other in a pose that screamed camaraderie. It was the same dynamic as always. Father and golden child, united in their shared vision of success. As if on cue, her father's eyes found Sarah. He waved her over with a hand adorned with a Rolex. "Sarah, come here." Reluctantly, she approached, already dreading the conversation. "Mike was just telling me about his plans for the future," her father began, his tone brimming with pride. "Aren't you impressed with your brother? Climbing the ladder so quickly." "I am," Sarah replied, her voice measured. "Congratulations, Mike." Mike turned to her, his grin wide, but his eyes sharp. "Thanks, sis. How's the business going?" "Still, finding your footing." There it was, the first jab of the night. Sarah swallowed hard. "It's challenging, but we're holding our own." Mike smirked. "Well, if you ever need help, I'm always here." Sarah nodded tightly, unwilling to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. The night wore on, with Sarah dodging probing questions from relatives and avoiding her father's well-meaning but cutting remarks. She thought she'd made it through the worst until Mike's voice rang out over the crowd. "Can I have everyone's attention, please?" he announced, standing on a makeshift stage. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to him. "I just want to say thank you to everyone who's been part of my journey. It's an honor to celebrate this milestone with you all. And while we're here, I wanted to share a little news about the family business." Sarah froze. Mike glanced directly at her, his grin widening. "You all know my sister, Sarah. She's been working so hard on her fashion company. It's been tough, but she's resilient. And because I care so much, I've decided to make her an offer. I'm going to buy her company and bring it under my management. Together, we'll turn it around." The room erupted in applause. Laughter rippled through the crowd, and Sarah's stomach churned. "Generous, isn't he?" her father added, beaming. Sarah's heart raced. She felt exposed, humiliated, and furious all at once. Her palms grew clammy as the weight of the room's attention bore down on her. But she didn't say a word. Instead, she set her glass down on the nearest table and walked toward the exit. The laughter faded into the background as she stepped into the cool night air. She inhaled deeply, trying to steady herself. Sitting in her car, she stared at the steering wheel, her mind racing. For years, she'd been fighting to prove her worth, to her family, to herself. And tonight had made one thing painfully clear. They would never see her as anything more than a failure. Her brother's words echoed in her head, but instead of shame, something else began to take root. Resolve. She gripped the steering wheel, her jaw tightening. "Not this time," she whispered. With a final glance at the glittering house behind her, Sarah drove off into the night, already planning her next move. What will Sarah do next? Can she turn the tables on her brother and father? Or will their combined power be too much for her to overcome? The hum of the sewing machines filled Sarah's office, a rhythmic reminder of the lifeblood of her company. Rolls of fabric lined the walls, and racks of half-finished garments stood as a testament to her vision. A sustainable fashion line that blended creativity with environmental consciousness. Yet tonight, the air was thick with tension. Sarah sat at her desk, staring at the financial reports splayed before her. Her chest tightened as she scanned the numbers. The business wasn't failing, but it was far from thriving. Profit margins were razor-thin, and every new order felt like a gamble. She leaned back, closing her eyes. Her mind drifted to the past, to the moment her life had taken a detour. It was her sophomore year of college when the call came. Their mother's cancer had returned, and it was aggressive. Mike, fresh out of undergrad and eager to start his MBA, had suggested hiring help. But Sarah couldn't stomach the idea. "I'll do it," she had said, dropping out of college without a second thought. For the next 2 years, she became her mother's caretaker. She cooked, cleaned, and sat by her bedside during endless chemo sessions. Mike visited occasionally, always impeccably dressed and full of stories about his classes and internships. "You're doing a great job, Sarah," he'd say, patting her on the shoulder before leaving for his next networking event. After their mother passed, Sarah was left with a gaping void and no clear path forward. Returning to school felt meaningless. Instead, she poured her energy into an idea she and her mother had dreamed about during those long hospital stays, a fashion brand that prioritized sustainability. "It won't be easy," her mother had said, her voice weak but full of warmth. "But you've got something special, Sarah. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Back in the present, Sarah opened her eyes, blinking away the sting of tears. She picked up a garment from the rack beside her, a jacket made from recycled materials. The craftsmanship was impeccable, but orders had slowed. Competitors with deeper pockets were flooding the market with cheaper alternatives, and keeping her business afloat felt like trying to plug a sinking ship with a single finger. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. A text from her assistant, Clara, lit up the screen. "Client from last month canceled. Said they're going with another supplier." "Sorry, Sarah." Her grip tightened on the phone. The party's events replayed in her mind. Mike's smug expression, the way her father had nodded in agreement, as if it were a foregone conclusion that she'd sell. Maybe they were right. Maybe she was out of her depth. She stood, pacing the room. The walls felt like they were closing in, each reminder of her hard work now an accusation. For a fleeting moment, the idea of selling crossed her mind. It would be easier. She could walk away, save herself the heartbreak of watching her dreams crumble. But then she thought about why she'd started this journey. The late nights, the sacrifices, the belief that her work meant something. Selling to Mike would erase all of that. It would validate every jab, every dismissive remark. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. She returned to her desk and opened her laptop. If her company was going down, it wouldn't be without a fight. Hours later, as the office emptied and the machines fell silent, Sarah stumbled upon a document buried deep in her files. The contract from her initial investor. She skimmed the dense legal text, her eyes glazing over until a particular clause caught her attention. She read it again, slower this time, her pulse quickening with each word. It outlined a buyout provision, one that would allow her to restructure the company under certain conditions. It was a long shot, but if executed correctly, it could give her the leverage she needed. She sat back, a spark of hope igniting in her chest. As the moonlight streamed through the office windows, Sarah began drafting a plan. This wasn't just about saving her company anymore. This was about reclaiming her narrative, proving to herself, and to them, that she was more than their assumptions. By the time she finally left the office, the faintest hint of a smile tugged at her lips. Sarah now has a potential weapon in her arsenal. But will it be enough to outmaneuver Mike and their father? The hum of determination filled the air as Sarah leaned over her desk. Stacks of papers spread before her like the pieces of a puzzle. Each document, each contract was a part of her plan, a calculated strategy to protect her company and, more importantly, her pride. The clause she discovered days ago had become the foundation of her efforts. It wasn't foolproof, but it was a chance, and that's all she needed. Consolidate, streamline, secure, Sarah murmured, her fingers flying across her laptop keyboard. She was pulling back assets, renegotiating deals, and setting up partnerships designed to strengthen her position. Every move was deliberate, a step toward making her company untouchable. Across town, Mike and their father sat in a leather-clad office, the air thick with self-satisfaction. "She won't resist," Mike said, reclining in his chair. "She doesn't have the backbone. Sarah's always been soft." Their father chuckled, swirling his whiskey. "You're probably right. She's too emotional. Always has been. But if she hesitates, we'll sweeten the deal. Give her a little extra and remind her it's for her own good." Mike nodded, a smug grin spreading across his face. "She'll fold. They always do when they know you're stronger." Their laughter echoed in the room, a sound of misplaced confidence. Back at her office, Sarah worked late into the night, her resolve hardening with every passing hour. She didn't tell Clara or her senior team about her plan, knowing the fewer people who knew, the better. She couldn't risk word getting back to Mike or her father. Every decision she made was shrouded in quiet determination. A warehouse lease was terminated. High-risk product lines were temporarily shelved. She even reached out to her former college professor, a sharp-witted legal expert who specialized in business law. "What's your angle here, Sarah?" the professor had asked during their call. "To protect what's mine," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "And to prove I'm not someone they can bulldoze." The professor's laugh was warm. "I've always liked your fire. Send me the details, and I'll see what we can do." The days blurred into a rhythm of action and anticipation. Sarah's phone buzzed constantly with updates from lawyers and suppliers. She barely had time to eat, let alone dwell on the growing tension with her family. Still, the weight of their betrayal gnawed at her. How had it come to this? Families were supposed to uplift one another, weren't they? A quick aside for you watching this. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who should have supported you? Maybe a boss, a friend, or even family. How did you handle it? Did you fight back? Or did you walk away? Let me know. I'd love to hear your story. Friday morning arrived with a quiet calm. The office was nearly empty, with most of Sarah's team working remotely or on-site at partner facilities. It was part of her plan to make the space appear desolate, a ghost of what it once was. She was reviewing the latest draft of her restructuring plan when the door swung open. "Sarah!" Mike's voice echoed in the quiet space, his confident strides announcing his presence before she even looked up. Sarah set her pen down slowly, turning to face him. "Mike," she said evenly, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" He looked around, his brow furrowing as he took in the emptiness of the office. The racks of clothes were gone, the fabric rolls neatly stored away. Even the usual hum of activity was absent. "Where is everyone?" he asked, his tone light, but with a hint of suspicion. "Out," Sarah replied simply. Mike laughed, though it sounded forced. "Out? You mean out of business?" Sarah met his gaze, unflinching. "Something like that." He smirked, brushing past her to peer into her office. I was worried you'd make this difficult, but it looks like you're already throwing in the towel." "Smart move, sis." Her jaw tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. "Well," Mike continued, stepping closer, "Dad, and I will be in touch soon to finalize everything. Don't worry, we'll make it painless." Without waiting for a response, he clapped her on the shoulder and strode toward the door. Sarah waited until he was gone before exhaling the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She could still hear his laughter echoing in her mind, but it only fueled her resolve. Mike left suspicious, but dismissive. Sarah's silence had given nothing away, but the storm brewing behind her calm exterior was far from over. Could she keep her plan intact long enough to strike? The morning sunlight streamed through the office windows, casting long shadows on the freshly polished floors. Sarah sat at her desk, perfectly poised, her fingers tapping lightly on a stack of neatly arranged documents. She felt the familiar swirl of anxiety in her stomach, but kept her face calm. Today was the day. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. Sarah straightened her posture as the door swung open, revealing Mike and their father, flanked by two sharply dressed lawyers. Mike wore his trademark smug grin, while their father exuded quiet authority, as though this was all just a formality. "Morning, sis," Mike said breezily, sliding his hands into his pockets. "We thought we'd stop by and help you tie up some loose ends." Sarah stood, extending a hand to each of them in turn. "Mike, Dad, I wasn't expecting you so early." Her father waved her comment off. "Best to get this over with quickly. We got a full day ahead." Mike chuckled. "Yeah, this shouldn't take long. Let's sit." The group settled around the table, the lawyers pulling out stacks of paperwork. One of them cleared his throat and began. "Miss Parker, we've prepared the acquisition agreement. Once signed, this will transfer ownership of your company to Mr. Parker and Mr. Michael Parker. The terms are generous, considering the company's challenges." Sarah smiled thinly. "Challenges. Interesting choice of words." Mike leaned forward, his grin widening. "Come on, Sarah. No need to drag this out. We're doing you a favor. You should be thanking us." The room went silent as Sarah pushed the documents away and stood. Her expression remained composed, but there was a spark in her eyes that made Mike's smile falter. "Before we proceed," she began, "there are a few things I'd like to clarify." She placed a folder on the table and opened it. Inside were copies of contracts, asset transfers, and financial statements. "Over the past week, I've made some adjustments to the company structure," Sarah said, her tone measured. "The assets you're interested in, equipment, inventory, intellectual property, have been legally transferred to a new entity. As of now, the business you're attempting to acquire is a shell, with liabilities and debt exceeding its value." Mike froze, his grin vanishing as he flipped through the documents. Their father's face darkened. "What is this?" he barked. Sarah met his glare with unwavering calm. "This is me protecting what I've built. The company you're trying to take over no longer holds any value. If you proceed with this acquisition, all you'll inherit is the debt. Mike slammed the papers down, his face flushed. You can't do this. I can, Sarah replied, her voice steady. And I have. The room erupted. Their father's voice boomed. This is deceitful. Unethical. Mike jabbed a finger at her. You think this makes you smart? You're playing dirty, Sarah. This isn't business. It's sabotage. Sarah let them vent, waiting until the room quieted before speaking again. You call it sabotage. I call it survival, she said, her tone cutting through the tension. For years, I've been told I wasn't good enough, that my choices were mistakes, that my success didn't count because it didn't look like yours. But this is what happens when you underestimate someone. You pushed me into a corner, and I fought back. That's business. Her words hung in the air. Their father leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight. You're playing a dangerous game, Sarah. She folded her arms. No more dangerous than the one you've been playing with my life. You've treated me like an afterthought, a failure. This was never about helping me. It was about control. Mike rose abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. His fists clenched at his sides. You think this is over? Sarah raised an eyebrow. It is for now. But if you'd like to escalate, be my guest. Just remember, I'm not the one walking into this blind. He stormed out, his footsteps echoing angrily down the hall. Their father lingered for a moment, his expression unreadable, before following him without a word. The office fell silent once more. Sarah sat down heavily, the adrenaline draining from her body. She stared at the empty table, her mind racing. Victory should have felt sweet, but it didn't. The confrontation had left a sour taste in her mouth, a bitter reminder of how fractured her family had become. She glanced at the folder of documents, her shield and sword in this battle, and felt a pang of sadness. Was it worth it? As she gazed out the window, the city's skyline bathed in golden light, Sarah realized she didn't have the answer. Not yet. As Sarah reflects on the cost of her actions, Mike's parting words linger in her mind. You think this is over? What will we do next? And is Sarah prepared for the fallout? The fallout came faster than Sarah expected. By the time she arrived home that evening, her phone was already buzzing nonstop. Family group chats were on fire, her inbox flooded with cryptic messages from relatives who hadn't spoken to her in years. The subject lines alone were enough to tighten the knot in her chest. How could you? So disappointed. We need to talk. Her father, predictably, had wasted no time spinning his narrative. By the next morning, Sarah's phone lit up with notifications from mutual acquaintances. I heard what happened, they'd say, their tones laced with either admiration or judgment. The family's reactions were divided. Uncle Robert, always the provocateur, called to congratulate her. It's about time someone stood up to those two, he chuckled. Your father's been calling the shots for everyone for decades. Good for you, kid. But Aunt Margaret was less forgiving. Sarah, I don't know how you sleep at night, she hissed during a voicemail. Family is everything, and you've burned bridges that can never be rebuilt. Shame on you. The lines were drawn. Some praised her independence. Others condemned her ruthlessness. Every call, every message, felt like another blow, leaving Sarah to wonder if the victory was worth the price. At the office, the tension was palpable. Sarah's team had always been small but tight-knit. Now, with the negative PR swirling, that bond was beginning to fray. I'm getting calls from suppliers asking if we're stable, Claire said one morning, her voice tight. Clients are nervous, Sarah. Some are pulling back. Sarah nodded, trying to hide the sinking feeling in her stomach. I'll handle it. Just keep the team focused on the orders we have. But it wasn't just the clients. Anonymous threats started trickling in, angry emails accusing her of being cold-hearted and manipulative. One particularly venomous message called her a selfish brat who ruined her own family for a quick buck. She knew Mike was behind it. His connections in the business world, combined with their father's influence, made them a formidable force. And now, they were using every tool at their disposal to isolate and discredit her. That evening, alone in her apartment, Sarah allowed the weight of it all to settle on her shoulders. She stared at the dim glow of the city skyline, her reflection faintly visible in the window. She'd fought so hard to protect what she'd built. But at what cost? Her reputation was in shambles, her family relationships fractured, and her company teetering on the edge. Tears welled up as she buried her face in her hands. For years, she kept going, driven by the belief that her work mattered. But now, she wasn't so sure. A knock at the door broke the silence. Wiping her eyes, she opened it to find her old college professor standing there, a warm smile on her face. "Thought you could use a friend," the professor said, holding up a bottle of wine. They sat on the couch, the wine glasses perched on the coffee table. Sarah poured her heart out, her voice cracking as she recounted the events of the past weeks. "I feel like I've lost everything," she admitted, her gaze fixed on her hands. "The business, my family, even myself. I don't know if I can keep doing this." Her mentor leaned forward, her expression kind but firm. "Sarah, do you remember why you started this? Why you gave up so much to build something from scratch?" Sarah hesitated, her mind flashing back to late nights with her mother, dreaming about a company that could make a difference. "You wanted to create something meaningful," her mentor continued. "And you've done that. Don't let the opinions of people who never believed in you dictate how you see yourself. You're stronger than that." The words settled in Sarah's chest, a small flicker of hope reigniting. The next morning, she arrived at her office with a renewed sense of purpose. She called a meeting with her team, addressing the challenges head-on. "We've weathered storms before," she said, her voice steady. "This one is no different. If we stay focused and support each other, we'll come out stronger." Her team nodded, their confidence bolstered by her resolve. Later that afternoon, as Sarah sifted through emails, one caught her eye. It was from an anonymous sender, the subject line ominous. "Something you should know about Mike." Her heart raced as she opened it. Attached was a document, a contract that bore Mike's signature. Her eyes widened as she read, realizing the implications. Mike had been sabotaging her company for months, steering clients away and undercutting her deals. Sarah stared at the screen, her emotions swirling between rage and betrayal. Mike's actions were worse than she'd imagined. But what could she do with this information? And at what cost? The email burned in Sarah's mind as she sat in her office, rereading the attached document. Each line confirmed what she had long suspected but hoped wasn't true. Mike had been sabotaging her company for months. Contracts quietly rerouted, deals mysteriously falling through, suppliers backing out at the last second. It was all his doing. Her stomach churned. She thought back to every smirk, every veiled jab, every condescending offer to help. He'd been playing a long game, and now she had proof. The time for quiet resistance was over. The following evening, Sarah arrived at a gala hosted by one of their family's longtime friends. She wasn't on the guest list, but she knew Mike would be there. Dressed in a sleek black suit, she strode through the entrance with a confidence that belied the turmoil inside her. She spotted him near the bar, surrounded by colleagues and acquaintances, his laughter ringing out over the clink of glasses. Sarah felt a flash of anger, but pushed it down. She needed to stay composed. "Mike," she called, her voice cutting through the din. He turned, his smile faltering as he saw her. "Sarah, didn't expect to see you here." She walked up to him, her eyes locking onto his. "We need to talk." Mike's grin returned, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Now's not really a good time. Why don't you call my office?" "This won't wait," Sarah interrupted, raising her voice just enough to draw the attention of the nearby crowd. "It's about the contracts you've been meddling with." The room grew quieter as people turned to watch. Mike's expression shifted from amusement to unease. "I have no idea what you're talking about," he said, his voice tight. Sarah pulled out her phone and held up the email, the incriminating document displayed on the screen. "Don't play dumb, Mike. I have proof that you've been steering clients and investors away from my company. You've been sabotaging me from the start." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Mike's colleagues exchanged uncertain glances, their whispers growing louder. "This is ridiculous," Mike snapped, his face reddening. "You're making a scene, Sarah?" "No, Mike," she said, her voice steady but sharp. "You made the scene when you decided to tear me down instead of competing fairly. You've been using your position, your connections, to crush my business. And now everyone here knows." Mike looked around, his confident facade crumbling as the weight of her words settled over the room. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Word of Mike's underhanded tactics spread, tarnishing his reputation within their industry. While he wasn't fired outright, his position at the firm became tenuous, his colleagues treating him with a newfound wariness. But Sarah's victory felt hollow. The next day, her father called, his voice cold and clipped. "What the hell were you thinking, airing our family's dirty laundry like that?" "I was defending myself," Sarah said, her frustration boiling over. "You stood by while Mike tried to destroy everything I've worked for. And now you're blaming me? You've made things worse for everyone," he snapped. "Mike's reputation, our family standing, it's all in shambles because of you." Sarah's heart sank, but she held her ground. "Maybe it's time you stopped worrying about appearances and started seeing the truth." He hung up without another word. In the weeks that followed, Sarah threw herself into rebuilding her company. The damage Mike had caused couldn't be undone overnight, but her team rallied around her, inspired by her resilience. Slowly, clients began to return, drawn by the story of a woman who refused to back down. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah sat on the rooftop of her office building. A soft breeze brushed against her face as she sipped a glass of wine, watching the sky shift from orange to deep purple. She thought about everything she'd lost, her family support, the sense of belonging she'd once craved. But she also thought about what she'd gained, a clearer sense of who she was and what she stood for. For the first time in years, she felt free. Her phone buzzed beside her. It was a text from an unknown number. "You think this is over?" "It's not." She stared at the message, her emotions swirling between frustration and a grim determination. Mike might not be done, but neither was she. Setting the phone aside, Sarah turned her gaze back to the horizon. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. She wasn't afraid anymore. The story closes with Sarah watching the sunset, her expression a mix of triumph and sadness. Mike's text leaves a lingering question. What's next in their battle? And is the price of standing tall worth the cost? The fallout from the gala had barely begun to settle when Sarah noticed a shift. It started subtly, whispers during meetings with clients, a hesitancy in emails that used to brim with enthusiasm. At first, she dismissed it as residual tension from the family drama. But soon, the signs became undeniable. A longtime client called her unexpectedly. "Sarah," the voice on the other end began hesitantly. "I don't know how to say this, but we're going to have to hold off on our next order." Sarah frowned, gripping the phone tighter. "Why? Is there a problem with the last shipment?" "No, the products were perfect," the client assured her. "It's just, I've been hearing things, rumors about your business practices. It's made some of our board members nervous." Sarah's heart sank. "What kind of rumors?" The client hesitated. "I don't want to get into specifics, but it's enough to make us reconsider our partnership for now." "I'm sorry, Sarah." The call ended, leaving Sarah staring at the receiver in disbelief. She could feel the blood drain from her face. Over the next week, the rumors grew louder. Mike's calculated retaliation was in full swing. Leveraging his industry connections and charm, he painted Sarah as an untrustworthy business owner. Stories about late payments, mismanaged funds, and unethical practices began to circulate. None of it was true, but that didn't matter. Perception was everything in their industry, and Mike knew how to manipulate it. Her team began to feel the strain. Clara burst into her office one morning, a stack of papers clutched in her hands. "3 more clients pulled out today," she said, her voice shaking. "They didn't even give a reason, just vague excuses about not feeling confident in us anymore." Sarah took the papers, her jaw tight. "We'll get through this," she said, though even she wasn't sure she believed it. But the cracks were forming. The team's morale was slipping. Employees whispered in the break room, and the usually vibrant energy of the office was replaced with a heavy gloom. One evening, long after everyone had left, Sarah sat alone in the office, her head in her hands. She barely noticed Clara entering, a cup of coffee in hand. "You look like you haven't slept in days," Clara said, setting the cup down gently. "I haven't," Sarah admitted, her voice hoarse. Clara sat across from her, folding her hands on the desk. "Talk to me. What's going on?" For a moment, Sarah considered brushing her off, but the exhaustion and pressure were too much to contain. The words spilled out in a torrent. "It's Mike. He's out to destroy me. And he's winning." Her voice cracked. "I've spent years building this company from nothing, and he's tearing it apart just to prove a point. My own brother, Clara. How did it come to this?" Clara listened quietly, her expression softening. "It's not just the business," Sarah continued, her eyes welling with tears. "It's the betrayal. I thought family was supposed to be there for you, protect you. Instead, they've been the ones trying to break me. And now I'm not even sure if I can keep fighting." Clara reached across the desk, squeezing Sarah's hand. "You've been through worse than this, Sarah. I know it hurts, but you're stronger than you think. You've built something incredible, and you're not just fighting for the company. You're fighting for yourself. Don't let Mike take that away from you." Sarah nodded, wiping her eyes. Clara's words didn't erase the pain, but they reminded her why she started. The next day, Sarah was reviewing investor updates when an email caught her eye. It was from a longtime investor, a major player in her company's success. The message was curt. "We need to discuss our partnership immediately. Call me." Her stomach churned as she dialed the number. The investor's voice was tense. "Sarah, I've been approached by someone, Mike Parker. He's made some insinuations about your company's stability. He even implied that maintaining my ties with you could jeopardize my other interests. Sarah's grip on the phone tightened. He's blackmailing you? Not outright, but the message was clear, the investor said. I don't want to cut ties, but I can't risk alienating someone as powerful as him. You need to figure this out, Sarah. Quickly. Sarah ended the call, her hands trembling with rage. Mike wasn't just spreading rumors. He was actively trying to dismantle her company from the inside out. She leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She needed a plan. If Mike thought he could bully her into submission, he was about to find out just how wrong he was. Sarah began strategizing her next move, determined to outmaneuver Mike once and for all. But with her company's future hanging by a thread, does she have enough time to stop him? Sarah sat at her desk, staring at the email from her investor. The words Mike Parker and jeopardize my interests echoed in her mind like a broken record. She couldn't shake the frustration and helplessness creeping into her thoughts. But somewhere in the haze of anger, an idea began to form. If Mike thought his power was unassailable, she'd have to prove him wrong. The next day, Sarah reached out to an unlikely contact, Julia Summers, a prominent entrepreneur who had once been one of Mike's largest clients. Julia had cut ties with him years ago, and though Sarah didn't know the full story, rumors suggested that Julia had suffered under Mike's manipulative business practices. The call was brief, but promising. Mike has no idea what's coming, Julia said, her voice cool and sharp. If you're willing to fight, I'm with you. A week later, Sarah and Julia sat in a private conference room with a small team of trusted legal experts and PR strategists. Julia had connections that Sarah could only dream of, and together they began crafting a plan to expose Mike's unethical behavior. Emails were combed through, testimonies gathered, and contracts scrutinized. What they uncovered was damning. Over the years, Mike had used his influence to strong-arm competitors, sabotage partnerships, and manipulate deals in his favor. This isn't just about you, Sarah, Julia said, her tone serious. Mike's been doing this for years. You're just the first to stand up to him publicly. Now, we make sure it sticks. The day of the final confrontation arrived. Julia had organized an industry forum under the guise of a networking event. Key players from their field were present: investors, executives, and media representatives. Sarah had been invited to speak on a panel about sustainability in business, a topic she knew like the back of her hand. Mike was there too, his presence commanding as always. He worked the room with ease, shaking hands and flashing his polished smile. Sarah could see the confidence radiating off him, but it only steeled her resolve. When it was her turn to speak, Sarah took the stage. Her opening remarks were about her journey, her passion for sustainable fashion, and the challenges of running an ethical business in a competitive world. But then, she shifted gears. There's something else I want to address today, she said, her voice steady and clear. For too long, businesses have operated under the assumption that power and success excuse unethical behavior. But that stops now. The room grew quiet as Sarah clicked through a presentation, revealing evidence of Mike's manipulations. Emails, contracts, and client testimonies appeared on the screen behind her, each more damning than the last. I'm not here to attack anyone personally, Sarah continued, her gaze sweeping the audience. But I won't stand by while integrity is sacrificed for greed. This is a moment for all of us to decide what kind of leaders we want to be. Mike's face turned crimson as murmurs spread through the crowd. He stood abruptly, his voice cutting through the room. This is outrageous, he bellowed. You're making baseless accusations to save your failing business. Julia stood from her seat in the front row, her voice calm but firm. They're not baseless, Mike. I've seen it firsthand, and so have others in this room. A few heads nodded in agreement, and whispers turned to outright conversations. Mike looked around, realizing the tide was turning against him. You don't understand, he said, his voice losing its edge. This is business. No, Mike, Sarah said, her tone steady. This is manipulation, and it's over. In the days that followed, the fallout was swift. Reports of Mike's unethical practices spread through the industry like wildfire, fueled by the evidence Sarah and Julia had presented. His firm suspended him, pending an internal investigation, and his name became synonymous with greed and corruption. But the victory came at a cost. Their father, ever loyal to his image, couldn't reconcile the public spectacle. In a terse phone call, he told Sarah he couldn't support her actions, even if she'd been right. This family has always valued loyalty, Sarah, he said, and you've thrown that away. Sarah didn't respond. What could she say to a man who saw loyalty as blind submission? Weeks later, Sarah sat in her office with Clara, reviewing plans for the company's next collection. We're moving forward, Sarah said, her tone lighter than it had been in months. It won't be easy, but we're still here. And that counts for something. Clara smiled, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. I think this is just the beginning. You got something real here, Sarah. The word stayed with Sarah long after Clara left. That evening, she climbed to the rooftop of the building, her usual spot for reflection. The sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Mike's threats, her father's disapproval, the weight of it all. It was still there, but it felt lighter now. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was rebuilding. Her phone buzzed beside her. She glanced at it, her lips curling into a small, knowing smile. Another message from Mike, no doubt another attempt to rattle her. She didn't even bother opening it. Instead, she set the phone aside and turned her gaze back to the horizon. The battle wasn't over. But for the first time in years, Sarah felt ready for whatever came next. Sarah's journey ends on a note of quiet resilience. The scars remain, but so does the determination to build something that matters. The future is uncertain, but Sarah is stronger for having faced the storm.